Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Neal, and I'm the city manager here in Edina. And it's my privilege to be able to welcome you here this morning to our Living Streets Day. I have a bit of a history with infrastructure myself as a city manager for 20-some years. I've been dealing with public infrastructure for almost half my adult life. And trying to get people interested in curb styles and sidewalk widths and gutter grates and trails and street widths and sidewalk panels and so on and so on. And that hasn't been easy, let me tell you. But what is exciting is to see people interested in concepts, exciting concepts like economic vitality and community health and environmental sustainability come together with the generally boring infrastructure guys and put something together like Living Streets that's exciting and can really make a positive difference in our community, not just in the near term, but in the long term as well for generations as we put down infrastructure that we expect to last for generations. The thing that I think that I find exciting in the Living Streets concept is the concept of balance. And I think you'll hear that throughout the day. It's really jumped out to me as I was preparing for today's workshop. Both the balance between the mechanical and the human aspects of infrastructure and the economics and the environmental aspects. The balance structure really steps out to me and I think is an important structure because I think we don't always achieve balance, but I think humans generally crave it. And I think as we go about our day, if we can internalize that and make balance a goal from the outset of our infrastructure planning process, it's something that makes it more likely to achieve it rather than something we try to add at the end of a process to appease one another. So it's my privilege at this point to introduce our mayor. Jim Hovland is the mayor of Edina. He had a chance to address a group last night that includes some of you, but I think does not include most of you on the subject of Living Streets, and it's my privilege to introduce him, and he'll take it from here. Mr. Mayor.
Well, good morning, everyone. We did have a good kickoff last night. Several of you were there. Catherine Bass from our Transportation Commission, who's also running the Dewtown project for Blue Cross Blue Shield, did just a terrific job last night, I thought. We've got Jennifer Janovic here from the Transportation Commission. Elon, we're sorry to see you moving, going back to Washington. Is that, yeah? And who else is here from the Transportation Commission? Oh, Paul, yeah, good. Michael, good to see you. This is, to me, I don't know, maybe it's a bit wonky, but this is a fascinating topic to me. And I do a lot of regional transportation work. In fact, yesterday noon, Wayne Houle, our city engineer, and I don't know, a couple hundred other people heard a guy from Paris talk about the future of transportation in France, and especially in the more populated areas like Paris. Well, I ended up with one of the engineers from the Intelligent Design Services Center at the university with the guy from France down in the Southdale district late in the afternoon. I don't really even know how it happened, but it was quite fortuitous. We walked the area, drove the area, and we talked about how a few years ago we had talked about the concept of PRT, personal rapid transit, maybe working in that particular area to move seniors around that aren't so mobile anymore, to move people around to their jobs, to move somebody around from where they work to a place they want to have lunch. And there's some interesting things going on in France from an equipment manufacturing standpoint. All this automated equipment that they have now over there that is basically self-propelled, all works off GPS. So there's a guy from France here talking about these kinds of things. We've got two fantastic presenters this morning. They're going to talk about this Living Streets concept. We don't know exactly what that means yet. We're going to work on that. We're going to work on it through our Transportation Commission and through a lot of our other boards and commissions, and especially through the people in our community, as we try to figure out that sort of interface between transportation infrastructure and, as Scott said, how do you help, when you start looking at things like economic development, the health of your community, the safety of the people that are in your community, how do you lay in a transportation infrastructure, a system that interfaces with all of those things and makes everything function well, and also add in beautification in the process. So we've got some people with us today that are going to give us a little bit of guidance on it, and in fact some very good guidance to get us started. Ryan, do you want to just stand up for a second here so people know who you are? Ryan Snyder is the president of Ryan Snyder Associates. It's a transportation planning firm that prepares bicycle plans, pedestrian plans, trail plans, safe routes to school plans, transit plans, and smart growth plans. He's coordinating development of a model street manual for the County of Los Angeles Department of Public Health. He's a Federal Highways Administration pedestrian safety design instructor, a certified National Safe Routes to School instructor, and a National Sustainable Advisor Program instructor. Snyder teaches a class on pedestrian and bicycle planning to graduate students in the UCLA Urban Planning Department. He's a former vice president of the Los Angeles Board of Transportation Commissioners, and he holds an MA in urban planning and a BA in economics from UCLA. So help me welcome Ryan. And Tom von Schrader. These are actually, you're from Ohio originally. Is that right?
Yeah.
So Mideast, and here's a Midwestern guy from Iowa, Tom von Schrader, and he is a founding partner of a company called SVR in Seattle, and they do planning, landscape architecture work, and other types of engineering work. He serves on the Mayor's Advisory Council in Seattle on the process of living creeks. How do we protect our urban creeks in the context of all these transportation things that we're doing? So we're going to get some great information from these two guys this morning. Tom, thanks for joining us, coming all the way from the West Coast. We really appreciate both of you being here. And Ryan, are you going to kick it off? Is that the way we're going to go? Okay, good.
Wow, what an impressive group of people. I'm really, truly impressed with everybody who's here and impressed with the number of people who are here. It's really great to see. And what I've noticed here, I've had to read up on Edina somewhat in preparation for this, and you're really ahead of the game compared to most cities across the country. You really are. The things that you're doing, the things that are in your policies, the things that are in your general plan are really on the cutting edge of things. And I think it's going to serve this city well. This is where the country is going. And not only the country, but this is a global movement. And for good reasons. All of the reasons that, we have people here who are interested in transportation and seniors and watershed management and safety and children and schools. All of these things come together under Living Streets. And so there's a whole host of reasons why we're even involved in Living Streets. And by the way, Living Streets has kind of evolved out of what is called Complete Streets, which essentially means that we're planning for all modes and all transportation modes, bike, transit, walk, car, as well as for people of all ages and physical abilities. Living Streets broadens that agenda to include all of these other issues. We're looking at health issues, we're looking at environmental issues, we're looking at livability issues, and all these other things that many of you are working with on a daily basis. But Living Streets is a very new term, and I'm impressed that you're already on this one, because there aren't many cities across the country that are yet. And even in our field, there aren't many practitioners that are caught up with the term Living Streets. But I think it's going to be a more kind of successful effort in that it brings in a broader range of issues and constituents for wanting to do many of these things. So with that, I'm going to present much of what is a national presentation put on by the National Complete Streets Coalition. That's who kind of, aside from the local host, brought us into this today. But for the first time, we have modified this workshop from a Complete Streets workshop to a Living Streets workshop. So you will see in a lot of the text the Complete Streets language, but we're really changing as much as we can. So we changed these modules to be a Living Streets workshop. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Here's a situation where obviously the people that designed or planned this weren't thinking about pedestrians and what it might be like to be walking along this sidewalk and then have it suddenly end. or a situation like this where somebody's waiting for the bus, but at a place where it's not particularly inviting. It's not the sort of thing, a place where you'd want to wait. I mean, he has no bench, he has no shelter, no information about when the next bus is coming, and doesn't have a really good place to stand, really. Probably subject to all of the elements as well as the cars going by and all that. It's not something that encourages people to use transit in this situation. We've kind of forgotten about the transit passenger when we have transit stops like this, or bike routes that maybe just end. Now, there are cases where we're legitimately implementing a bikeway system and we don't have it all built yet, and we're putting it in incrementally, so we may have bikeways end, but we want to have continuous networks eventually. Or how about a person in a wheelchair that needs to cross the street and they've got a ramp on one side. When we get to the other side, what's he going to do? There's no ramp there. So he's going to end up probably going in the street, which is not a safe place for him to be. And it's probably going to make him nervous. You know, it's not a pleasant place for him to be. And so, again, when this was being designed and thought about, somebody had forgotten about people in wheelchairs. So this is what we're trying to do in Complete Streets, is really, or Living Streets, is think about all of the users and all of the situations they might be in, so we're really accommodating. Our system has been too much designed just for the car, and we've forgotten all of the other users in the meantime. We do know how to build things right. We've learned a whole lot. We're still actually, this field is expanding, and there's a whole new set of devices and techniques that we're using nowadays. So there's still a lot we're learning, but in general, we do know how to do things. We do know how to accommodate the different users, the different modes, and the different people, and people of all, again, ages and physical abilities. Yet we still build quite a few roads like this. And to a large degree, this is because of the common practice, but it's also because of what I like to think of as the DNA of our streets. Now, the DNA of our streets often comes in the form of standards and manuals. And when I say DNA, I mean it's very much like the DNA, like the chromosomes that determine whether or not you have blonde hair or brown eyes, or you're tall, or you're thin, or whatever. It's the same thing. When you look at the street standards and the design guidelines that are in the manuals that the city is using, this is kind of what they said to do. They said this is they classified this street, probably a major arterial, something like that, and in their book it says major arterial has to be so many feet wide and it has to have so many lanes, and each of the lanes are going to be so wide, and the length of the blocks are going to be so long, and the left turn pockets are going to be so long, and if they remember to put a sidewalk in, it may be a little 5-foot sidewalk with no buffer in between. But that is what gets built when that's what you have in your standards. So we'll talk more about design manuals and standards later on, but this is kind of, again, the result of that, of this sort of this thinking that this is what we need to build. And this really results from, again, for the folks who came last night, I apologize, there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but this really stems from sort of some thinking that started in, I think, in the 1920s. If you look at photos of American cities back around 1915 or 1920, you will see some cars in those cities, but you will see people. You might see streetcars as well. You will see people in the street, walking down the middle of the street, crossing the street at any location, and they're part of the street. And then this thinking came along in the late 20s that said, the streets are for cars, we need to get people out of the way of the cars, pedestrians should cross only at certain locations, only at certain times. And from about that time on, that was sort of the beginning of when we started designing streets for cars and forgetting other users of the streets. And we've been doing it that way ever since. And so now we're coming along all these years later and starting to look at some of the consequences of that. and what it's brought us in the way of obesity and climate change and energy shortages and all of these other issues that we're dealing with in cities that are not easy for children or seniors to get around in. So that's what we're up against. A complete street, as I said, is a street that's safe and comfortable and convenient to travel by automobile, foot, bicycle, or transit. And it also, again, users of all types. We've talked about that. This is the introductory slide. We've already gone through this. So just an outline of what we're going to do today. We're going to introduce living streets, is what we're doing right now. We're going to talk about the difference. We've already talked about the difference between complete streets and living streets. We've done complete streets. Now I'm going to talk about what living streets are and what they look like. Then we're going to talk about street classification and a new way of looking at streets, performance measures and how these come into play when we're designing our streets and looking to see what they're accomplishing for us, a new way of making decisions, and how to implement it. Then we want to spend a good piece of the afternoon today creating the beginnings of a living streets policy for Edina. So we'll get into real workshop mode in the afternoon where you're going to be drafting up the policies. So that's what we'll do today. Living streets is something where we hope that everybody wins. Living streets prioritize people, not cars. It's a very different way of thinking of our streets. And we'll now go over what we call the 10 principles of living streets. The first one is, again, complete streets, provide for all users, all modes, all ages, and physical abilities. And this is to ensure that the entire right-of-way is designed for all users. Living streets integrate income equity into their design and function. Too often, just even by design of the streets, we've forgotten people of certain income categories. And so we're trying to really think about equity. We want to have pedestrian-oriented design. You may recognize Nicolette Mall in the picture up there on the right. But this is, the difference between the two pictures on the left. The one on the left is a shopping center in Los Angeles, close to where I live. That was built just really in the last 6 years or so. And they completely forgot about people and how people would react to the sidewalk. There's this big blank wall along the street, a very narrow sidewalk with lamp posts in the middle of it. Just, again, a new sidewalk. And it always, every time you see a brand new sidewalk, it's an opportunity to do things right. And when I see brand new concrete poured, now that money spent on a new sidewalk and it's done wrong, it just, it really makes me cringe because we've just wasted public money, or in this case, probably developer money, on doing something wrong. But the slide in the bottom right is a picture of State Street in Santa Barbara. And the picture in the bottom left is a picture of State Street in Santa Barbara as well, about 2 miles north of there. This first one is in the older part of Santa Barbara, where we've got buildings next to one another, facing the sidewalk, opening onto the sidewalk, a really nice wide sidewalk. We've got landscaping and curb extensions and decorative street furniture and a whole host of things to service the pedestrian and to make sure that the pedestrian's comfortable and to relate to the stores there are opening their doors to pedestrians walking by. Whereas the one that was built a little bit later on, probably circa 1960s or 70s, is a part of State Street that is very auto-oriented. The parking was put in front. The sidewalk's very narrow, doesn't have a buffer, and guess what? You don't have any pedestrians there either, because we've planned and designed for the car. So that's how people will arrive. Living streets connect people through everyday interaction. And this is really, it's an intangible, but I think it's a really important, the social aspect of our streets is a really important one. When we look at this slide here, this diagram, this is part of Don Appleyard's research from UC Berkeley in the late 60s or early 70s. He did a study to find out how many people know their neighbors on 3 different types of streets. He wanted to see if there was a correlation between traffic and social connections. And on the one on the top has the least amount of traffic on the street. And you can see that he drew the social connections in. How many of your neighbors do you know and regularly socialize with? And you could see that, the social connections were many. But as you go down this diagram here, the one in the middle had sort of moderate traffic, and the one on the bottom had higher traffic. And he found that the social connections were broken with traffic. And so, the lesson from that is that, our streets, if they're designed to just accommodate a lot of cars, will sort of break up the social connections. And social connections are just so important in every phase of our life and society and making us successful. But I told the story last night of this down here. A colleague, a friend of mine, Dan Burden, and I were walking around, and I took him to the walk streets in Manhattan Beach. Do you see that? Now, these are streets that don't have cars in front of them. The cars come in for the alleys in the back of the homes. And the homes face it's like a big sidewalk or a very small street. And the neighbors all get to know one another. And it's a very social environment. We were just walking up the street and we saw this family out having dinner. And we stopped and talked to them. Just random. I mean, how often would that happen if you were walking along a busy street with a lot of cars, where you get to know somebody who lives there? And we stopped and talked to them for 20 minutes. And we asked them a few questions about their street and what they liked about it. And without us telling them and introducing a lot of sort of jargon that we use in our profession, they told us that they really enjoyed living on the street because of the fact that they got to know their neighbors, and that it was just a much more friendly, more relaxed place to live, and that they wouldn't live anywhere else. But and then as we walked up the street, we met a whole bunch of other people living on the street. It wouldn't take too long to get to know all of your neighbors. We also, as we got further up there, found a little sort of wiffle ball baseball game going on with some young kids. And we saw, these kids were probably like 6 years old up to maybe 8 years old. And then there was an adult kind of playing with them and supervising them. And we saw a mother coming back from the store. She had just walked a couple blocks over and bought some groceries and walked back home. And she said, "Thanks for watching the kids," to this other adult. So this was just a neighbor who was out watching her kids. And, just the idea that neighbors become real neighbors and you help one another out. It was just so easy and conducive in this environment where their street fostered that interaction. The other thing we want to do with our streets is get people involved in the design of them. So they're part of designing of their streets. And so from early on, as we're changing our streets, we'd like to have the stakeholders all involved in that. We want our streets to enhance the neighborhood. They should strengthen the neighborhood. And thinking about the character of the neighborhood, every community has its own character, and often every neighborhood. You could probably talk about the different neighborhoods in Edina, and you've got a little bit, each one maybe have a little bit different personality. And what we like to do is make sure that there's a strong personality that reflects the people there. And so your streets should enhance and make the neighborhood a better place. We also want to foster active lifestyles. Again, for people of all ages, I really like this term I recently learned called lifelong communities. These are communities that work well for 7-year-olds and 77-year-olds. So it doesn't matter what age you are, it's a community where you can thrive in and have an active and a healthy lifestyle. This picture is actually on one of the trails near Lake Calhoun, between Lake Calhoun and downtown Minneapolis. Wonderful place. The trail network in this region is phenomenal, by the way. I don't know if you knew that really on a national level, your trail network stands out quite a bit. But we want our streets to accommodate a healthy lifestyle. In many places, they don't. We're also going to think about managing the environmental aspect of our streets. To a large degree, this has to do with managing street water, which is storm water as well as watering, irrigation, watering of lawns and watering of cars and all that sort of thing. What happens to that water? With common storm systems, the water rushes down into the storm drain and into the local waterway somewhere, often untreated. Now, I don't know if you have if it runs in your sewage system here or if you have two systems, but this is, in many places, the primary source of pollution in our waterways. It's called urban runoff. So now we're thinking about the idea that we need to let the water filtrate in where it's at and capture it on site. And if it does get into the local, we do want to recharge underground water supplies, but after the water's been filtered. So we'll set up these things. This is a bioswale here. And Tom actually knows a whole lot more about this than I do, but rain gardens and pervious concrete, and there's all sorts of different ways that we can let the water infiltrate in. And we also, we call harvest the water on site. We treat the water as a resource rather than waste. And so this technique solves a number of problems. It helps our water supply as well as our water quality in our waterways. So this is a really important part. And along with green sort of sustainable management, we're also thinking about energy issues and other environmental sustainability issues of our streets. We want our streets to be inviting places. They should be places where you want to be. I usually think, we've kind of, in transportation, we've sort of depersonalized a pedestrian has become a transportation type or something, and it's really, to me, it's a walking person as a pedestrian. And we don't want to forget that and to not depersonalize it, but this is a person who's out there. And we want to make sure that our streets are good places for people to be and places that they want to be. They feel safe, they feel comfortable, and they're enjoying their experience there. We also want to support healthy commerce. Our streets should do that. And if they're well designed, they will. This is Nicollet Mall. And lots of people like to go there and eat and patronize the local merchants there. And if it's an inviting place, it's good for business. And communities that have living streets are good places for business because people want to live there, people want to shop there. The residents of that community will shop in their own community instead of going to some other community. People will come from other communities to shop there, or even thinking on the level of tourism. When you go on vacation, there may be some vacations where you're going to go to some remote island or up to the mountains to get away from people, but when you're going on a vacation to visit a community or a city, you're probably going to go to a city that has really good streets, that has a lot of people out walking, good pedestrian environment. So that's inviting. When you think of your favorite cities and the places you want to visit, often there are those kinds of cities, or even the kind of places you want to go on a Saturday night or a Sunday afternoon. Often it might be a place where there are other people out, and it's because there's a healthy environment for that and for that commerce there. Last, living streets vary in character. There's no one prototype. There's a whole bunch of different types of living streets. This happens to be the downtown transit mall in Denver. It's got buses running down one lane about every 90 seconds or so, and they're free. But the other side of this is just all pedestrians and bicycles. And this street is one of my favorite streets in the country. It's full of people. It's landscaped. It's beautiful. It's an inviting place to be. And people like to go there just to hang out, and they shop. And they go to restaurants along this mall. So it's become a real vibrant retail area. But this is one type. We could have on the opposite end of the spectrum, and this is in downtown Denver. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we can have a single family residential neighborhood. That's a living street type. We could have a mixed-use neighborhood. That's a living street type. We could have a multi-family residential neighborhood. That's a living street type. And then we could have a historical neighborhood. I mean, there's all sorts of living streets, but they all have these general characteristics that we talked about. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tom for a while and let him carry on.
I was, just by way of what I'm going to finish up the introduction to you, but one of the things I'd first like to do is tell you that I was privileged to be able to spend a bunch of time here last winter working with, on a design competition, I believe, with you guys over there. And it was a lot of fun, but I realized what Ryan said, that this community as a whole has some really good bones. There's a lot to build on here, so I think you're very lucky. One of the things I'd like to talk to you about right now is, something I think that will help you think about how you want to put together a living street policy, and that's something that we do in our practice. It's a systematic approach to what we're looking at. So much the same way as the body and has constituent parts that all have to be working together, your skeletal system, your circulatory system, which would be like your mobility, they all have to be healthy, and they all have to be working together. Oops. So one of the things we've done is kind of developed a periodic table of elements that we apply to street design and living streets. They include social, circulatory, which would be more of mobility, metabolic, how much energy do we use in the streets, biologic, those are the biologic functions that help us treat the stormwater and clean the stormwater, hydrologic, how much water is moving through and how much water do we need to maintain on site or harvest so that we're not overtaxing our systems downstreams, and geologic, do we have the right geology in our right-of-way to be able to, one of the most important things we'd like to do is to be able to infiltrate groundwater. So we have basically interventions on all of these things and apply them to projects. This is a project we did on a Bainbridge Island, which is just outside of downtown Seattle. It's a 25-minute ferry ride. And as you can see, what we've done is we started to overlay these systems. And these aren't the only systems that you would want to look at, but they're systems that I think are kind of emblematic of what a Complete Streets program would be. So in our energy diagram, we're using LED traffic signals, increasing non-motorized opportunities, so we aren't burning as much fossil fuel. PV cell-powered lighting. We have plug-ins for electric cars. We're using recycled pavement, much less embodied energy in the recycled pavement. And the community, I'm sorry, this is very difficult to see, but in the community side, we have a multifunctional street. There are gathering spaces where people can meet. There are street plazas. The mobility, we have continuous sidewalks for the first time, and sidewalks that are accessible. We have bike lanes. This project was actually just built. We're really excited about it. Unfortunately, I didn't bring any images, so I'll try to send those to you guys so you can get some images as it comes along. But we have bike lanes, we have sharrows, we have transit stops, there's mid-block crossings, and pedestrian street lighting. Habitat, we've got incredible street canopy. In this particular project, we use a system called silvacells, which allowed us to put street trees right in the middle of the street. And put pavement over them. We put a porous pavement over them. But this is going to allow us to grow these huge umbrageous trees that are going to be able to provide tree canopy. And then we have an urban forest understory that provides a lot of coolness. Water, we have rain gardens, which we call bioretention. We have street-side cisterns that we're going to use to store water for irrigation. We have conveyance rentals, porous pavement again, and stormwater planters. And then underneath, you see how the rest works. So one of the cool things about this is we've actually built a model of this for the community, and you can look down on it, and you can see where these systems, this is a systematic approach, but where these systems overlap is where the magic occurs. This is what we kind of call high-performance landscapes for living streets. They're high performance because they're performing multiple functions. And that's kind of what I'd like to get across to you today is that's what I really feel is important, I think we all do for a living street, is that we do look at this in a multifunctional sort of way. So why have a living street policy? To make the needs of the user the default for everyday street design and practice. We don't have to be thinking about this. We want that to be, okay, this is the new normal for us. There's no need to prove that pedestrian, bike, and transit facilities are needed. We don't need to waste that energy when we have a living streets policy. Rather to assume they are needed unless otherwise proven. Again, to shift, why have the policy? To shift transportation investments so they create better street opportunities. What we want to do is we want to have that just it's automatically in place. When you're going in and you're ripping up a street, that you have a policy that tells you, okay, we're going to come back in and we're going to do these interventions that are going to give us a street that is a better living street. To ensure that funds are used differently. Every project creates a better street now. So if you've got an overlay program for your streets, it doesn't cost that much more to use a little paint, to stripe in a bike lane, to narrow that travel lane and stripe in a bike lane. And with a Living Streets policy, that does tend to be more automatic. And to save money, I think this is something that Ryan mentioned last night, but it's really important that you're paying for if you're doing some street improvements, you're paying for a contractor to mobilize out there. But you don't want to do that twice. If you can save that money, and knowing that you're eventually going to want a sidewalk, you want to save that money up front. So it is cheaper to actually doing it initially and doing it right initially. Another important thing about Living Streets policy is it's not going to happen all at once. You're not going to have your whole community isn't going to be, but it gives you a framework for completing a network of roads that serve all users. And I think that's really critically important. So it's over time that you're building a network that is going to serve all users. And finally, and why have a Living Streets policy is to give design professionals political and community support for innovations and solutions. This is really important to me because I'm a design professional that make active living possible. A real good example of this is we're in another design competition in Brooklyn where we're competing to design a couple of streets and avenues that we're crossing. And we just kind of went crazy with the whole thing and developed a whole new nomenclature for streets. So we had a biovard, which was going to be the one street that had an enormous runnel down the center of it that was going to treat all the stormwaters that came through. And then instead of curb bulbs, we decided we were going to have these urb bulbs, or urban bulbs. And they were going to, inside of those urban bulbs, we were taking care of the water along the major avenue. So instead of the urban bulbs, we had activities that were going to be more, being out and able to play bocce ball, being able to play, go out and have lunch tables and stuff like that. So I think it's really important that these policies give design professionals that kind of license to be creative and try new things. And finally, because it's the right thing to do. Why have a living street? Because it's the right thing to do. This is a picture of Ray LaHood and Barbara McCann, who's AD of the National Coalition for Complete Streets. A complete streets approach offers a perfect intersection of my twin, this is a quote, of my twin guideposts, safety and livable communities. So who wants a living street? You can see a show of hands. Who wants a living street? Oh, right. Good, you're in the right place. Most Americans would rather drive less and walk more. Transit is growing faster than populations are driving. About 1/3 of Americans don't drive. And this is pretty telling. I thought about this, but 21% of Americans over 65. A lot of older people don't drive because they don't feel it's safe. Sometimes they get their license taken away. But 21% of people over 65, so that gives you a sense of how many people maybe don't drive. Children under 16 don't drive. They certainly use the right-of-way, but they don't drive. And low-income Americans can't afford to drive. So there's a lot of people who don't drive and who would want to walk more. Oops. Did I skip something? Nope. Americans want complete streets. This is another telling graphic that I really like. It's how respondents would allocate transportation funding. So you go out there and you ask the country at large, how would you want your transportation funding? And it came back 37% for roads, 41% for public transit, and 22% for walk and bike. Now, we look at how transportation is currently allocated, and you can see it is definitely skewed towards the roads and the vehicle side, with 70 and almost 80%, 20% for transit, and a kind of a paltry 1% for bike and walk. Benefits of complete streets for older Americans, 21% of who are over 5 do not drive, over 50% of non-drivers stay at home on any given day because they lack travel options. So if you can't get out and you don't have a sidewalk, if you don't have access to transit, people are staying at home. This certainly it doesn't do the community a lot of good. 54% of older Americans living in inhospitable neighborhoods would walk and ride if things are improved. This is another statistic that tells you that living streets are, and what you guys are trying to do, are going to be important for all sections or a lot of components of our community. There's a health benefit of living streets. Now Americans move without moving. I like that. Healthy water to drink and swim in. I come from Seattle, and the Puget Sound is an incredible natural wonder. It's a beautiful facility. It's similar to some of the rivers you have here, but it's a beautiful thing. But we get the runoff from the streets, the urban areas around the Puget Sound, and this is from the University of Washington did this study, is 1 Exxon Valdez per year of hydrocarbons that are dumped into the Puget Sound, just runoff off our roads, which is incredible that we have the opportunity to be able to treat that water, and we're not doing it. 60% are at risk for diseases because of the lack of facilities associated with inactivities. These include obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and other chronic diseases.
I'm just curious, are your waterways here safe to swim in? Your lakes and rivers and so forth?
Some are, some aren't.
Some are?
Some even right here are substandard.
Okay, and is urban runoff a big part of that? All right.
And the salt, it impacts the river system too, doesn't it?
Salt in, like, I live in a neighborhood called Cornelia, and those waterways are polluted both by runoff from a mall and from the freeway, as well as chlorides.
Another benefit, physical activities. Residents are more likely to walk in a neighborhood with sidewalks. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. Cities with more bike lane get more bicycling. It certainly is true in the cities in Seattle that as we move through our first phase of our bicycle master plan, and we're striping year before last we striped almost 60 miles of new bike lanes. You see the use is going up consistently as these come online. And a third of regular transit users meet the minimum daily physical activity requirement during their commute. They use the sidewalks, or a lot of times if I'm going to Bellevue or something, I'll ride my bike down to the transit tunnel and then put my bike on the bus. So they use the facilities to get there and get their exercise at the same time. Another really interesting graphic about obesity and physical activity. As you can see, the red line is essentially the percent of obesity. Along the bottom are various countries, and the green line is the percent of walk, bike, ride, transit. So you can see we're bracketed in with the USA on one side, where we have high obesity rates and low ability to walk, bike, and use transit. And bracketed on the other side is Switzerland and Denmark, where we've got much lower obesity rates and very good systems to be able to get out there and use the sidewalks and use the bike lanes. Safety is another really critical issue. Intersections designed for pedestrian can reduce pedestrian risk by 28%, and sidewalks reduce pedestrian crash risk by 88%. I mean, I don't know, I know there are a number of places, I believe in the city, that don't have sidewalks, and I'm sure you all realize how uncomfortable that could be walking on there, and how you don't really feel that safe. Again, benefits for people with disabilities, improve mobility for people with disabilities, and it improves mobility for people with disabilities and reduces the need for expensive paratransit systems. Most people would rather get out and walk, be able to get that exercise. The environment, again, there's fewer emissions, less noise pollution, less wear and tear on our roads. We're driving less, there's less wear and tear on the roads. Less need to widen roads. We don't have that capacity issue where we so we don't have to widen roads. It's a kind of a 1970s mentality that, okay, the solution is to add more lanes and widen roads to get capacity improved. We need to look at maybe managing demand a little bit better. Less water runoff into local waterways. I'll get into this a little bit more, but one of the big things streets are coming into play now is with CSOs and the consent decrees that are coming out of EPA to be able to manage your combined sewer overflows. There's a number of projects, pilot projects in some cities now where they're using green infrastructure in the right-of-way. Those would be like rain gardens and bio retention facilities to manage the stormwater that's actually going into a combined system and then overflowing and polluting the waterways. Conserve energy and reuse water, save energy, and reduce waste are their environmental benefits. And again, like less need to widen roads. And that's because of, we don't need to widen roads if we don't have that capacity issue. Trips in the metro area, 50% are less than 3 miles, 28% are less than a mile, but 68% of those trips under 1 mile are now taken by car. And a big reason for that is because there aren't the facilities out there that people would want to walk. So that's a big issue. The economy in your wallet has a benefit also. Multimodal streets increase the value, home values. And this has been proven that, you know, you have these multimodal streets and you have these streets that everybody wants to live on, and then it'll increase the value of your home. It can revitalize retail, and it can, people can leave their car at home. Another benefit are more livable communities. Living streets create a better place to live and a better place to work. When we just opened up this project on Bainbridge Island, just before it got cold and last spring, the community decided they wanted to have a street party. So they actually had a sit-down dinner for 1,500 people on white tablecloths down the whole length of the downtown street. And I've got some great pictures of that too, I'll show you. But it really does make the community more livable. And people were so excited about it. It was really jazzed to see the way the people were kind of using their street in a much different way, in a much better way. How living streets change the built environment. This is, I love this picture, but I love it and I hate it in the same way, but you can see how far this traffic light is away. It looks like it's a quarter of a mile. And this is an older woman who's going to have to, probably not going to be able to make that crossing in the time that the signal allows for. So it's kind of an anxious moment, I'm sure, for her. Living streets changes intersection design into something like this, where essentially you have a pedestrian, you have a refuge. You go out there and you build a median so that people feel comfortable crossing the street and getting out there walking. Changing bicycling. I don't know, I do this all the time where I'm riding on a fog line and it doesn't feel real safe for me. It's so easy with a lot of times with just a little paint to be able to make that a much more comfortable way to get around. Oops. Sorry. Living street changes transit. And, you know, you've seen this image before. It's a difficult thing. How is anybody going to get there? If you're in a wheelchair, how are you going to get there to use the transit? It's these systems that are coming online now where people are getting really smart about how to mix buses, how to mix pedestrians, and how to mix, bicycles. Living street changes accessibility. This is another classic one. And this happened on Bainbridge Island. Before we were able to, there were people out on the street in their wheelchairs because they couldn't use the sidewalks. They changed in accessibility to systems like this where you actually have people are able to move through the community. Again, this is the changes in stormwater runoff. You're able to manage your stormwater on your street and provide, and the cool thing about this too is it's not just managing stormwater, but you're using these things like these bioswales, these rain gardens, to provide separation, to provide those refuges. They've got double function, which makes them all, like I say, high performance. So here, for example, this is a bioretention rain garden that's actually providing separation from the streetway and the sidewalk. Living streets and trails also. Living streets provide access to trails, and you've got a wonderful trail system here. the way you're going to get to those trails, a lot of people are going to use those trails, but they don't want to drive to the trails. So your living streets are going to be your way, they're going to be your routes to get to these trail systems that, everybody wants to use recreationally. Living streets and trails represent or equal a comprehensive non-motorized network, and living streets take the pressure off overcrowded trails. If we have a trail in Seattle called the Burke-Gimlin Trail, and a lot of people use that to commute, but a lot of people come off that trail and get to work that way. So it's a real nice system, both the trails and the living streets. And this is important, I think living streets it's not a design prescription. Ryan and I were talking about this last night. Living streets, it's not really codified, or there's not some sort of statutory threshold right now that says, oh my gosh, you got a living street. It is really community-based, and you need to be sitting down and thinking, okay, what is important in this neighborhood? What do I want to have done? It's not a design prescription. It's not a mandate for immediate retrofit. You got to be realistic. There's only so much money. We can't immediately retrofit all of our streets. And it's not a silver bullet. These need to be combined with other initiatives, and they have to be addressed, such as land use and other things. But living streets will help. So what does a living street look like? Like we say, one size doesn't fit all. Living streets doesn't mean every street has to have a sidewalk, bike lane, or transit. There is no magic formula. You need to be nimble, and you need to be flexible in the way that you look at a living street. We did some work in Hawaii once where they had a street, and the whole issue about the street was vegetation management. It was just as simple as managing some of the vegetation on the side of the road so people would have a place to walk and a place to bike. As simple as that. Like I say, there's no magic formula. And we'll get into this more too, but a lot of it is operation and maintenance. How you maintain your systems too is just as important as how you plan, design, and construct them. There are many types of living streets. There's a low-speed shared street, one of my favorites. There's one crossing, many types of one crossing, complete safe routes to school, shouldered bikeways on rural roads, busy multimodal thoroughfares, transit routes, transit routes, we're just putting in some transit routes in the city of Seattle right now that are working wonderfully. Suburban thoroughfares, residential skinny streets, historic main streets, and low traffic shared streets. And this is a European model, and I think this is in Germany, isn't it? It's Freiburg. It's basically what the Dutch would call a Wiener, but it's a living street. And you can see some guys pulled out a ping pong table into the street. It's perfectly legal, and it's a great way great use for the street. Low traffic shared streets, another type of living street. And this is a wonderful picture. This was Ryan was mentioning about
the baseball game.
The baseball game took Dan Burden around Manhattan Beach and came up on this. Maybe you tell about the little girl, because I thought that was such a wonderful story.
Yeah, here's the baseball game, and this little girl right here is sitting in the middle of the street with her legs crossed, and I don't know where she learned this from her parents or something. She's like doing a mantra or some sort of meditation, and it just always strikes me that someone would do that sort of thing in a place where they felt really relaxed and comfortable, and I thought it was kind of amusing that she found that place to be the middle of this street in front of her neighborhood, in front of her house.
It's a great image. And there are many types of streets. This is a street in Seattle, Washington. It's the first permeable pavement street in the Northwest. It was built still functioning. They're not actually building anymore now, but it was built in probably about 6 years ago now. Again, this is a redevelopment of a neighborhood in Seattle, West Seattle, and this shows you the stormwater quality facilities are used along the side of the road. Living streets also need to address context sensitivity. It's really important that a street addresses the neighborhood and the area that it's around. A living street doesn't mean every street has sidewalks, bike lanes, and transit. There's internal context, that's land use, external context, land use, and internal context, is who is likely to use it, the street, bicyclists, pedestrian, transit users, or drivers. Those are all the kind of things you need to think about as you're thinking about what's the highest and best use for this street. I think this is the biggest challenge we all have, is that we're trying to cram 50 pounds of stuff into a 10-pound bag, and you got to be very careful about that 10 pounds you're putting in there to make sure that it's the right 10 pounds. What do design guidelines tell us? The Astro Green Book states that sidewalks are an integral part of city streets, not added to part of. Shoulders are desirable in urban arterials. Bike lanes are shoulders reserved for bicycle use. Permission. I think this is important. Many transportation engineers and planners know how to build good streets. They're seeking permission to do so. The Living Streets is going to, a good Living Streets policy is going to give them permission to do it that way. What about funding? Living Streets is about using existing resources differently. There's a bunch of funding that comes out, STP, equity bonuses, and such. So while retrofit funding is important, it is not necessary to get started. Additional funding is not needed. Does it cost more? No, not necessarily. You avoid costly retrofits when you have a living street policy that tells you up front, this is what we expect. There's minimal additional funding, and it saves money with better design. Some sample low-cost improvements: restriping a bike lane without moving the curbs or drainage. That's something actually that the city of Port Townsend in Washington just did. They moved curb bulbs out where they had a catch basin, so they didn't have to bear the cost of that, moving your drainage system around. Put a bioretention around it, use the catch basin then with a beehive grate as an overflow. Do not construct in overly wide lanes. Use 12 foot instead of 11. Sidewalks installed during drainage projects at little cost. You're going to be digging up areas. You've got equipment out there. Like I say, you're still paying for the mobilization. Timing signals to control speeds and increase safety is a low-cost improvement. And countdown PED signals reduce crashes, another cost and other low-cost improvements. A transformative moment. This is so where we're standing today. We're kind of in the throes of an economy that's still sputtering along. It's nationally. There's increasing gas prices. We've got these epidemics of obesity. The CDC now recommends complete streets to prevent obesity. I think it's really interesting that the CDC now has there's a woman at the CDC who is an urban planner who's looking at how our built environment, specifically our streets, affect human health. There's a growing awareness that quality of life is an economic engine. And climate change and sustainability, I think, are really important now. They're really coming into the fold. People are starting to say, okay, I got to stand up and I got to start worrying about these things. The great place to do that is in a complete streets policy. A living complete streets policy ensures that the entire right-of-way is planned, designed, and operated to follow the living street principles. Those are the principles that we covered, or Marion covered earlier. Living streets are sensitive to the community, serve adjacent land uses, and serve all who potentially will use the street. And I think now we're ready for an exercise.